Hello and welcome to the Keystone Kickoff Show. I'm Jim Galante along with Thomas Frank Carr. T. Frank, how we doing this week?
Doing great. It's spring break, so next week football. It's that simple. We're back.
That is, I'll tell you, I got to ask you first off. I know obviously you follow Penn State football. I know you're an NFL guy. When those two worlds clash like they do with the combine, are you all over the combine?
Oh yeah, watched all weekend. I didn't watch. I'm not like I used to be when I was in college or just out of college, where I'd watch every single day and every single hour, so thoroughly. But yeah, I was in there for the major moments. I did kind of skip Saturday, and I watched some of the running backs, but I don't know. Like my team doesn't really need a quarterback. I'm not necessarily concerned with that, and I just don't believe they're going to take a receiver.
Well, and of course, for those who don't know, you're talking about the Buffalo Bills, correct?
Yeah, yeah. That they met with a lot of receivers from what I know, but I don't know. We'll see what we'll get a better idea of all of that later when you get to the private workouts and pro days and stuff like that. Which, by the way, still significant intrigue for Penn State at their pro day on March 15th because Olu Fashanu came up, pulled a quad during his first 40 and then didn't do anything for the rest of the day. So Penn State will have Hunter Norzad and Olu Fashanu. I'm assuming Hunter's going to go by the by the pro day. He didn't participate on Sunday of the combine. And then Kalen King, he's got to make up some ground here. He's got to stop the bleeding on his profile to show he can run faster than a 4.61 or whatever it was, which is pretty terrible for a corner at a position where speed's pretty important.
Definitely, definitely. And I wonder if between now and then, you think Olu's hands could get any bigger between now and then?
They do have some of those hand stretchers. You know, you can get a massage and have it loosen up. You can maybe get an eighth of an inch. So hopefully, for his sake, or just wear fake hands, like wear those Hulk hands. You can walk
Yeah.
around like that and be measured that way.
All right. We'll maybe get into the combine a little later, but I was always interested. As I remind our listeners, T. Frank not only appears on video, he also is an excellent writer. Put out a great article last week. 5 burning questions for the Penn State Nittany Lions going into their spring practice. I'd like to go over some of that with you. I think it's really intriguing, T. Frank. And let's start with one that I think a lot of people have focused on, and that's
Yeah.
Abdul Carter moving to defensive end. My first question to you personally, though, is do you agree with the move?
If I'm reading the tea leaves of what they're doing, yeah, sure. I don't disagree with the move. Um, I'm just curious how it's going to work out. I never take anything for granted. I don't presume that a guy who has rushed the passer 200 total times is going to be a freak pass rusher right out of the box. And that's kind of just my curiosity of what does it look like? That's what for us then, and honestly, for the coaches too, that's what spring football is for. Now, there are a lot of times last year where he would play edge rusher essentially in a 5-man odd front. So this isn't totally new, and I'm sure a lot of that, which is on film, made them feel comfortable that this would be an easy transition. And then, by the way, I'm not predicting it's going to be a bad transition. I'm just my curiosity lies in where do we get by the end of all of it.
Well, let's start with this, though. How big of an adjustment is it to go from linebacker, the way he played linebacker, to a defensive end position, T. Frank?
So there's a little bit of overlap. But playing off ball 4 yards off the line of scrimmage is just different. You've got to read different things. It comes at you at different angles and speeds. It from the people I've talked to, when you're up on the line of scrimmage, it's instantaneous reactions. There's no time to think. You've got to know what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to see your stimulus and you're supposed to attack. So it is different, but there are elements of what he's done in the past where he would run blitz off the second level, and he'd be doing some of those things anyway. So you see evidence of how they could use him and how he was used last year. That does translate to playing defensive end in certain situations, certain ways. Obviously, on third down, we know he's rushed the passer from a couple of different positions. So there's going to be a transition. There's no way around that. There's going to be a transition, and there's going to be some different elements of his game that we're going to learn about, and that's going to get started here in about a week.
What are the technical aspects of the position, defensive end, that he's going to have to learn or adjust to or adapt to, T. Frank?
Yeah, so I spoke with our mutual friend Landon Tengwall on this show last week. I want to say it was, and just taking the reverse of it, he talked about how Olu Fashanu has been great at using his hands to essentially stymie pass rushes, to just neutralize pass rushes and the momentum they create. So I guess that would be the inverse of create momentum, create a certain amount of. He talked about setting up moves for later in the game. So that is kind of the game within the game. How do you set up a tackle to then win with a different move? Kind of keep them guessing and anticipating and being wrong about what you're about to do. So it's not just the proficiency of those moves. It's then, okay, how am I going to deploy these things? Or am I going to just run off the edge as fast as possible every single time and threaten the edge so he opens up wide in his stance and in his pass protection arc? So that there's different things within pass rushing that I think go into the transition from linebacker to defensive end that Deion Barnes is very good at teaching these things. He's very good at observation and application, and obviously great at relating to his players. But I would say it's the moves and the plan as a pass rusher that are a big thing, because I think he's going to be able to handle the run pretty well. He's been very good, I think, at shedding blocks through his career.
Is this adjustment, change in position? Can we find a comparison with Chop Robinson and what he was doing at Maryland, and then what he became a strictly defensive end at Penn State? And I bring that up for also from the coaching side of it. Penn State had to do something like that previously. So does that make it easier for the coaching staff to understand what they need to teach?
Well, I don't think it changes what they need to teach. Just because he came from linebacker. Zariah Fisher was a linebacker. There have been other guys. They're not coming to my mind. Nick Tarburton is who I was thinking of. Was formerly a linebacker. So this is a common conversion. I don't want to make it harder than it is, but there's just these gaps in knowledge on our end, my end specifically, talking from my perspective of what is his understanding of the science of pass rushing. Like, he can be very good at it and not know what he's doing because he's athletic and he has a rudimentary use of his hands but how do you go up against a tackle in a game and consistently win, get to that threshold of 20+% win percentage against tackles and, getting pressure and sacks and forced fumbles? All of that starts with your understanding of what your opponent is trying to do and how to put that person at a disadvantage. So that's really, it's just learning all of those things more in depth, I imagine. So that would be, I don't know. I'm not trying to downplay it, but I'm also not trying to say like this is a thing that it could fail. Like he's an elite athlete. He's got great football instincts. He's going to make the transition, but this spring, I guess, is the lab to do that. And where I want to know is at the end of this, is he elite? And I know that word gets thrown around a lot, but I mean from a production standpoint, from a measurable standpoint of he gets X number of pressures, his rate is very good. He on film is causing the offense problems. Because if that is the case, where you've got two guys in Abdul Carter and Dennis Sutton on the edge, they can be one of the best pass rushing tandems we've seen. And we just saw one of the best passing rushing tandems we've seen from Penn State with Chop Robinson and Adisa Isaac. These two guys have different skill sets, but they are uniquely dominant in those traits. So speed, explosion, coming off the ball for Carter, and then power, finesse, and length for Dennis Sutton. So you might have a truly elite advantage at defensive end. But when does Carter get to that? What's the timeline on that? Because it has to be in September, but how quickly do we see it?
And it's the spring where you work on these things and hopefully make that transition smooth. You also, in your article, brought up one other thing. You talked about thinking less and playing more with instinct, I guess is the way to put it. And you've talked about this at other positions, even like Nick Singleton, for example, as a running back, where as a
Mhm.
freshman, it seemed like he didn't know what he didn't know, played instinctively, started to become technically a better running back, understanding things, but it meant he was also thinking about it. So is that a concern with Abdul Carter moving to a new position, that it's going to be less instinctive and more thinking, or does making him a defensive end just by the position he's playing, defensive end might be thought of as a more instinctive position?
So it's that second one. I don't want to. There is a lot of thinking that goes into almost every position in football. So in terms of, he's got to know, the best defensive ends know what the offense is trying to do. So they understand run schemes. They understand how to defeat run schemes. They understand how, teams can chip and when to be aware of those things. So there's a lot of thinking that is involved as a defensive end. But when the ball is snapped, you got to go make your move. So it is less thinking during the play. So if he's still thinking about all that stuff, like, it can be a problem. But if he's done the homework and on the front end, he knows what he's doing and he's studied and absorbed all the information, then he can play fast. It is a more instinctive position of, that it's a quicker time to the contact. So therefore it's a quicker time to react. So those things do play in the favor of somebody that you want to play faster, as long as they're dialed in. And I would expect that from Abdul. You don't get to play as a freshman if you are completely not paying attention.
Okay, in the final minute we have, should there be any concern about his ability to play against the run, all of a sudden now being in the defensive line as opposed to a linebacker?
No. He's 250 pounds. Penn State basically had an extra 2 defensive ends on the field between Kobe King and Abdul Carter last season, because both those guys, they had the physicality and play through contact like defensive ends. So I wouldn't think that there's any issue playing the run. Chop Robinson and Adisa Isaac are about the same size. Adisa weighed in at 247 pounds and was really good against the run. So I don't think that would be an issue. Again, it would all be about, is he thinking in the moment instead of playing? But I don't think that, I just couldn't see that happening for Penn State. But I've been wrong before. You never know.
Oh, you've never been wrong, T. Frank. All right, that is it for quarter number 1 and the Abdul Carter talk. We've got lots more to go. Stick around for quarter number 2 and more burning questions. Hello and welcome back to the Keystone Kickoff Show. It's quarter number 2. He's T. Frank. I'm Jim. This is our burning questions for the spring segment of our show. If you weren't with us in the first quarter, go back and listen to it. We talked about Abdul Carter, but what we're doing for the whole show is we're talking about T. Frank's article from last week, Blue White Illustrated, 5 burning questions for the spring. Quarter number 1, we talked about Abdul Carter and that move to defensive end. I think that's the thing most people are going to be looking for in the spring. I always were intrigued by it. Let's talk about another one of your burning questions. Essentially, it's, how will the cornerback position shake out? You got to remember, this isn't losing 1, not 2, but 3 cornerbacks who will probably all be playing on Sundays come this fall, T. Frank. That's a lot of talent to lose at one position.
Yeah, and so these first couple questions, though, I would say they're more like charcoals. Like, these are kind of if we're smoking something, we'll use these burning questions because they're not all that hot. This one maybe, a little bit. I think we know Cam Miller is going to be the top guy. And I think you should feel encouraged about the fact that he's been a part of the rotation since he was a freshman. They have been preparing him for this for 2 years now. And I would say he's looked good in those opportunities. Not perfect, but he's been good. And there have been encouraging signs, even in a game like the Peach Bowl, where he's going up against a top corner or top receiver, excuse me. So then it becomes the other 2 positions. And I think the outside corner, we know the guys that are preparing for that battle. So, even if we don't know Jalen Kimber yet, if you've watched him on film, seen T. Frank's film room, we kind of know what he can do. He's a pretty well-defined 5th-year player. Learning more about Zion Tracy, that's a part of this story. But then really the interesting thing, I think, is who's the slot. Who's going to be the slot corner? That might be that role in general could take a step back this year. It will be matchup dependent for sure. But if Penn State wants to get 3 safeties on the field, it's not just linebackers that suffer for that. Like, they also do the job of a slot corner. So will that be a dime package deal? And who is the player that steps into that role? Because it's probably going to be one of these guys we're talking about on the outside. I don't think they're going to have a slot only guy just yet. Maybe they could. Maybe one of those freshmen could earn that job. But it looks to me like it would be, and I'm literally ballparking guys that I think have the skills to do it. Cam Miller and Zion Tracy are the 2 that I would think right away have the opportunity to do that, with a couple other guys we could talk about later. But really, just that slot corner position, I think I'm ultra curious. Who are the guys that Penn State thinks have the physical skills to play that position? Which one of these corners is going to get that role on the defense? Because that is an important role and one that is going to come up in big games. So I'm curious to know who are the guys on the list.
I'm more curious about that slot position also, but going back to the outside, when you mentioned Jalen Kimber and Zion Tracy, I was curious to you, Frank. In your article, you didn't mention AJ Harris, and I don't know. Well, you tell me. Should AJ Harris be in that mix?
Okay. So here's the thing you got to understand about articles like this is I could name every single player at the position. I could put every single player in the article, because somebody asked me, why didn't you put Elliot Washington in the article? And it's like, well, if you cover Penn State football, or if you follow Penn State football, yes, you're smart. You know Elliot Washington is on the roster. This is, I have to cap it at a certain point. So when we have, the top 4 guys, I think that are from a logical standpoint, and this is the reasoning. Cam Miller is obviously number 1. Jalen Kimber was brought in here for a reason. Then you have Zion Tracy, who's gotten the most snaps of this group. So Elliot Washington, Antoine Belgrave Shorter, John Mitchell, those guys are in the conversation for sure. But it's not fun to read 8 names in every single paragraph. So I just cut it off after a certain number, presuming that we understand AJ Harris is on the football team, who's brought in, but is a redshirt freshman. So when you're handicapping these things, that's, I guess, in my calculation, that's what's going into this. Is these are the names I'm reasonably sure are a part of the conversation based on the evidence. But also, I think Elliot Washington is super talented. I think he's very serious. I think he's going to come at everything the right way. And I think he's got an opportunity to be a part of this conversation. But there's just, he had some setbacks his first year, and he has had to work through those. So if we're doing the horse race comparison, like, he's got some ground to make up, and he can do that quite easily this spring. But heading into training camp, these are the names that kind of make the list of, okay, we need to make this paragraph shorter than my answer about why those names aren't in there.
All right, fair enough. All right, let's go back to that slot position, because as Penn State fans and the Penn State defense and coaches, I think we're a little bit spoiled the last couple of years. It was pretty obvious. You had Daquan Hardy, and you had him doing a great job last year. And I think what needs to be understood is it's not always like that, where you have such a definitive, this is the guy, he's going to play that position, and that's the end of the discussion. It's a little bit more of an open question where you're going to get that slot defender, correct?
Yeah, and it's really been for 3 years now, going all the way back to 2021, when Penn State had an elite defense the last year under Brent Pry. They were very good, and Hardy was instinctive and picked the ball off and had pass breakups, and I thought he really showed what he could do then. But it was a bit role in a certain sense, because they had so many issues against the run that they had to keep linebackers and safeties on the field. And then you saw him kind of grow into the role even more over the last couple of years. So that's just another question of, like, not only who is going to do the job, but are they going to take to it immediately? Are they going to be able to do it to that level? Are they going to be able to do it to a level that it implies future stardom if you can from a slot corner, which isn't a thing. But, like being a standout at a position where we've been talking about Daquan Hardy now in glowing terms for most of his career. So I think that it's definitely something in Tom Allen's defense. They're going to face a lot of 3 receiver situations. So they've got to have a pure corner that can do it. And just, kind of the burning question is, I don't know which one of these guys has the skills to play on the interior, which can be the same as the outside or can be different, depending on the scheme and the system and what you're able to do from a physical standpoint. You saw at the combine, Daquan Hardy was explosive, impressive, fluid, fast, all the things he needed to be. So that's the skill set of what you need. A guy that can change direction quickly, is fast, explosive, and twitchy, I think is the word scouts love to use. So that's why I went with Cam Miller. I think he's a really good fluid mover. John Reed is a guy who played on the outside and the slot previously for Penn State. And then Zion Tracy is another guy. And I'm not comparing these like to like, just guys that have done both. Johnny Dixon also played the slot before. So Zion Tracy and Cam Miller kind of fit those roles where I guess I see right now Jalen Kimber based on what I saw of him on film from Florida, which is not fair because it's a totally different scheme, but he was very much an outside corner. He was an outside only guy even when there were situations where they could have put him in the slot or he stayed on the outside for the most part. So of the 3 that we're kind of discussing here, I would say those are the 2, with one of those freshmen, maybe John Mitchell or Belgrave Shorter, as another option in the rotation if they prove they're good enough and they're ready to go.
All right, T. Frank, let's move on to your next question. Number 3, the burning questions for the spring. How will Tom Allen adjust to the Penn State talent? Tell me what you mean by that.
There's an unlimited number of things that I mean by that. That's the thing, is like kind of the framework is more firm with Tom Allen coming to Penn State, where, we know certain things about how he's going to play from a style, philosophical standpoint, certain tenets in his defense that aren't going to change. But here's an example. I was watching some film, put this on the message board. One of the reasons why you should follow, because not everything gets to do an article, but here in this situation, watching film of Tom Allen's defense, they had a very hard designation of who was the 3 technique and who was the 1 technique. They had very firm designations of left and right corner, boundary safety, field safety. And the way they used some of their personnel was pretty different than what Penn State has done in the past, where they've had more fluidity between the positions. So is that one of the negotiables on the table for Tom Allen? Now that he has guys that have the ability to play the run and also be athletic, Devon Ellies can play nose tackle. He's athletic enough that in a run situation, he can play a 3 technique. Zane Durant's strong enough. He can take on some double teams. So the way Manny Diaz used everybody was where you started, wasn't where you ended. And that ambiguity gave Penn State's defensive tackles an advantage. So Tom Allen plays much more static positions of this is a 3 technique, this is a 1 technique, and you know which way to run based on what you want to take advantage of, which player, which alignment, etc. Which means those guys have to play to a higher level unless you're more unpredictable. And was Tom Allen more predictable because his talent could only do certain things? Or is that something he believes in? He thinks it's important to have those things set for guys to play fast, etc. There's a bunch of different things we could talk about too, in terms of splits between man and zone coverage, how he uses certain personnel, whether it's 3 safeties, 3 cornerbacks, 3 linebackers. What are the tweaks for Penn State in the Tom Allen flavor of doing this 4-2 defense that has vacillated between a 4-2 and a 4-3? So I think that those are the interesting things that we have to nail down. I think we have a better idea of kind of the parameters of the conversation to narrow in on, okay, this is what they're doing, as opposed to the offense, which I think is much more wide open at this point.
And we'll get to the offensive questions in quarter number 4, but still sticking with Tom Allen and defense. And you bring up another point, which I think is good. It may be one thing in the base defense, but where things start to get intriguing is when you have special situations like 3rd and long, and it's a passing situation. We knew what we were going to get with Manny Diaz and Daquan Hardy last year. That becomes very different with the change in talent and the change in coach.
Yeah, and that's really, that's why I guess I've been thinking about this offseason of it's interesting that not only are there opportunities with Jacobs and Hardy moving on, but there's also this wide open, we don't have to establish anything because the talent and the experience that did those things is leaving. So we can not start over, but we can much more easily adapt to a new defense because we have all these vacant sub-system, sub-package positions. So what does that lead a creative person who wants to do a lot of different things to do? I think that leaves it open for interpretation because you're right. We don't have the talent and the scheme are both changing at the same time in these certain areas that determine a lot of this.
Very good, T. Frank. That's it for quarter two. Stick around, quarter three. We've got your questions, and we've got Ask T. Frank. Hello, and welcome back to the Keystone Kickoff Show. It's quarter number three. That means it's time for Ask T. Frank. We take your questions, and T. Frank always gives us a fantastic answer. If you want to send a question in to T. Frank, real easy. All you got to do, download our app, Keystone Sports. That's Keystone Sports. Download it, and you will see the Ask T. Frank button, and away you go. Joe from Scranton did exactly that. Here's his question, T. Frank. Why did you think Fashanu can't run block? You think he will be drafted high because he'll keep the quarterback from getting hit. The pros don't run the ball very much. No sacks allowed over 600 snaps is how he'll make his money. Robinson and Isaac couldn't beat him in practice per Landon Tengwall. Not sure there's quite a question in there.
Good job, Joe. I think that's a fair. I think there's some. We always do this, right? Where we embellish certain things. The pros don't run the ball at all, and you only need to pass block. Those aren't true. There are areas where Olu can get better as a run blocker. But your point is valid. I think that the tenets of what do you want out of your left tackle? Somebody who is going to allow you to throw the football in obvious passing situations. And Olu is a good run blocker. He's just not bulletproof. And, Joe Alt's a really good football player. And there's a couple of guys, you look at Marius Mims and he's 6'8", 340 and looks like he looks like he runs ultra marathons. Like just not that someone, he doesn't look like an offensive lineman. He doesn't look like he runs ultra marathons. That's ridiculous. I mean, he just looks like an action figure. Like he's cut at 340. And then you've got Fuaga. This is a really good tackle class. So I think the conversation, and this is always what happens in the draft, is you start to magnify the flaws to point out the differences between the prospects. And while if you're the evaluator in the back of your mind, this is still an awesome football player. He's just, if we're comparing, trying to make this an apples to apples comparison, where are the flaws? And with Olu, he's got kind of an obvious one with some of his run blocking. I think at the second level, he struggles to get to the ball there. There's evidence of him being, a crushing down blocker, but it's not consistent. And then there's some times where he needs to latch onto his player and stay with that block, and guys get away from him. So that's as much a technique and just a general polish thing as opposed to he can't do it. There's some things with leverage that I think are what they are. Penn State, Chuck Losey's talked about it. They talk about it. I'd love to have seen some of these things at the combine, watching go through some of those drills, but he just plays a little high at times because that's his body type, but he still finds a way to be effective in the most important things. So yeah, I mean, for a non-question, I hope we got an answer there.
I think you did well, but I think you also pointed out some of the flaws in our game, T. Frank, is when we talk about Fashanu, Joe generalizes and said, essentially, you said he can't run block. Well, it's more like he's a great pass blocker. He may not be quite as good as a run blocker. That's not saying he can't do it. It's just saying he's even better as a pass blocker. And I think also, especially when you're talking about these draft predictions, and most of them that I see have Joe Alt going prior to Olu.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean Olu's not a good player if he's the second
Right.
tackle taken. It's pretty much a compliment to Joe Alt. And I don't know if you were the one who said it or somebody else said Joe Alt probably has the higher floor. Olu may have the higher ceiling, though, of the two.
Yeah,
Is
and
that
so
you?
I was listening to a podcast. I wrote about this a couple weeks, last week or something like that, leading into the combine, where former NFL GM said between the two, Olu has a higher ceiling. And again, the athleticism and the ability, you would expect more as a run blocker. And that was something where I think he improved this past year, but he didn't have dominant, putting dudes on their back sort of thing. And there's some really good run blocks. You can go to the Iowa game. I think he did a good job there, but consistently dominating at the point of attack and getting to the second level and ripping open these gigantic runs. I mean, I thought the offensive line didn't get enough credit for blocking really well, but Olu at 6'6", 320 and moving the way he does, that's the comparison. It's what you see, and then what you get is not quite what you see. And that's just the nuance to the conversation of kind of some of the negativity around him. I think it's gone too far. There are certain people that are saying, like, does he even know how to run block? And that's ridiculous. Like, it's always in the middle. It's always more in the middle. But I think he's going to be a guy that can get to where he's not a liability at any point in the run game. That is a fair floor for him. It's just, does he provide you game-changing blocks?
And most of the drafts projections that I saw, the lowest I see him picked is like 10th. Okay, if you're the 10th pick
Right.
in the draft, you're doing pretty well. Let's go to Alan in Wayne, Pennsylvania, who says, what stood out to you, T. Frank, among the Penn State players at the Combine? For me, it was the poor showing of Kalen King.
Well, I'm a positive person, so I want to talk about Curtis Jacobs. Runs a 4.58, jumps really well. Unfortunately I didn't get to see. We were at max testing day, so I didn't get to see the drill portion as much. But his testing, going into it, we talked about how he's going to have to be a coverage linebacker because he hasn't proven a whole lot that he has excelled in the box. Now, he wasn't ever there full time to really kind of get into it and really get comfortable there. He kept bouncing between the two positions, but even in the small sample sizes, he didn't really excel all that much. Again, kind of like the Olu run blocking conversation. I don't think he was a liability, but he wasn't. I guess Tony Rojas in a smaller sample size at will linebacker lit things up, and Curtis Jacobs, when he had a starting level time during games, was good in the box, but he never made a name for himself as a devastating run defender. I also thought it was interesting that he came in at 241 pounds. I don't think he's ever played above 235 at Penn State. So the decision to get heavier, I think maybe certain teams will see him as a modern Mike. I've heard that over the last year that certain teams saw, and this is, again, you kind of go by body type and you go by what we've seen happen in the past. And a guy who did a similar thing was Fred Warner, where he went from playing the Sam linebacker at BYU and then was moved to Mike by the 49ers, became a generationally great Mike linebacker. I still see Curtis as a will. I still think that's where he fits into that conversation. And the combine that he had showed he can cover, he can run, he's big enough, he can hold that weight and be fast. So I think it was a huge win for Curtis.
I'll tell you what impressed me, and it's not just Chop Robinson, but all of these big guys who are just so fast. A defensive end, 250 pounds, and he's running a 4.48.
Yeah.
That's really moving, especially for a big man. All right, let's go. T. Frank, you got this question is from Frank in Boyertown. He says, T. Frank, I'm excited by the class of second-year offensive linemen. Could you give me your evaluation and expectations for them? Also, which ones are tackles and who's an interior offensive lineman?
I'm writing them down quickly so I don't forget anybody. And we have to put Chimdy. I always forget to talk about Chimdy. So Anthony Donko, let's start there. I wrote about him last week, talking about how he has exceeded his 5-star and high 4-star teammates in that class of 2023 by being super talented and also a preparationaholic and able to, translate all of that into play. So he is in the battle. And from everything that, again, the name list conversation, he's in the battle for the starting right tackle position. And it kind of feels like he is starting with the lead because he's been in the program for a year and has, more institutional knowledge. Javen Williams, left tackle. He's played left tackle the entire time he's been here. I have seen him do reps at right tackle for whatever that's worth. Maybe still long-term he could project it to the interior, but they want to have that depth on the outside behind Drew Shelton, Donko, and Nolan Rucci. So he's a tackle. And then Alex Birchmeier has been working at right guard, and he had to get a little bigger and stronger. So he's a naturally big kid, but talking to him, he said getting strength in his lower body, understanding football versus wrestling, and making sure that he was playing offensive line like an offensive lineman, I think, not relying so much on some of those leverage and strength and body balance things, and, playing with your feet and your hands. And then we'll see where he is in the spring. I think it's a big spring to understand where he is. And then Chimdi Ono is massive now. I saw him the other day. He's 320 pounds, and he's another tackle. I think he's a developmental player, not part of the conversation. So really, Donko is the guy that has the open opportunity to play this upcoming year. And then we'll see what happens, with the other guys competing at the positions they're competing at.
And none of them burned the red shirt, correct? Donka didn't burn his red shirt.
No, none of them burned their red shirt.
I think that's the other part that's pretty exciting, but they all have freshman eligibility and 4 years left. So, all right, let's go to Mike in Pittsburgh, who says, T. Frank, high school quarterback Matt Zollers has shot up the rankings, similar to Drew Aller and Ethan Grunkmeyer. Can you explain how that happened? Is there really that much improvement? Is the ranking services not seeing them? Is it not going to different camps? How is this consistently happening, it seems, with the quarterbacks?
So I think that we get a little bit, the ranking systems are not an algorithm on your phone that's continually updating by AI. People have to go watch the film. They have to make the evaluations, and they have to know about these players. So Matt Zollers is from Springford, I think it is, in Pennsylvania.
In Royersford,
and it's not a big school where if you're going to start like, okay, I need to knock out a bunch of national rankings, and I'm going to go to, the national ranking schools. So, when a guy pops up and you see his film, On3 updated the 2025 class recently. So these moves happen when you do these big updates. It's not like it's little incremental updates where a guy can climb slowly. If suddenly he bursts on the scene, he's got all the talent, he's got the arm strength, the mobility, he shows it on film. I know clutchability was a big thing with Charles Power in this update with Zollers. That's how these things happen. It's not done instantaneously. It has to be kind of chunk updated. And then, as we get more testing data and we get more information about these guys growing and changing, that is where some of those updates happen in the summer as well.
Very good, T. Frank. That is it for quarter number 3. And Ask T. Frank, stick around. We've got more burning questions in quarter number 4. Hello and welcome back to the Keystone Kickoff Show. He's T. Frank. I'm Jim. We've got an hour of Penn State football talk. We're through 3 quarters of it. We had a good time in the first 2 segments talking about some burning questions. We were on the defensive side of the ball. Then we took your questions and asked T. Frank. I just wanted to follow up on that last question about Matt Zollers and just how the process works, T. Frank, with the evaluations. It's also, there's just a difference between, the football powers and, scouts are always there. People are always there watching those players. So it's, those players are up front, forward, evaluated all the time. And we were talking off the air a little bit. Zollers went to a school, or is going to a school, that isn't known for producing a lot of football elite players. So that guy might get overlooked for a little while. Eventually, they find him, pretty much all of them, though, right, Frank? T. Frank?
Yeah, I wouldn't. So it's interesting. The internet's huge, and anyone can see your film. Doesn't mean that everyone is going to see your film, but he got an offer from Penn State last fall, and I think that should tell you something. Like during his junior season, he gets an offer from Penn State. They've been really good at identifying these guys. You know, I think Danny O'Brien gets a lot of credit for being a consistent recruiter. You know, I think Mike Yursich knew quarterbacks and offered quarterbacks that Luke Kromenhoek became a 5-star and it didn't come to Penn State, but was one of Penn State's top targets in the last cycle. You know, you get Ethan Grunkmeyer, you find him, you identify that he's got the skills you're looking for. So you still end up with a top 10 quarterback, but they identified 2 of the top 10 quarterbacks in the nation before a lot of other people. So I just think Penn State's evaluation process and their ability to see talent on film is notable. And then from there, you know, they get, I don't want to say they get lucky, but it is fortunate that a top 10 quarterback exists in their backyard. So it's not like we learned about Matt Zollers last week. You know, Penn State's been aware of him. He's gotten offers, you know, one school gives an offer and suddenly like there's an auto bid where 17 other schools follow along with Penn State and this kid gets an offer. And suddenly you have somebody who went from regional prospect to national player. And sometimes that fades and sometimes it doesn't. And with Zollers, it's not, you know, he's put up the film to back everything up. Now it's going to be about what we see when he gets, if he decides to go to some of the camp circuits and things like that.
One last note before we get to the burning questions. We had an offensive lineman while he was still in high school, came to Penn State several years ago on our show, and he told us this little story. Penn State was the first major school to offer him, and he said he was told by them, watch, you are going to get a boatload of offers now that we offered you. Yep. And that's also part of the process. And I think it makes the ranking system. Hey, wait a minute. Alabama, Georgia, Ohio State are offering this guy. What do they know that we don't? And they go back and they reevaluate. All right, let's go back to the burning questions, T. Frank, and let's get to the offensive side of the ball. And I love this question. How will Andy Kotelnicki use Katron Allen and Nick Singleton? All right, T. Frank, how will he?
I don't know, and that's why it's a burning question. You know, there are some of these that have answers, like Abdul Carter. How is he going to translate to defensive end? Good. Like he's going to be good. It's will he be dominant out of the box? Is he one of those guys that comes out ready, fully formed? We know the names to know with the corner position. You can feel reasonably confident that it's going to be a good group. Maybe they're not the same that they've been the last 3 years, but you know, the talent is there. How Andy Kotelnicki uses these 2 guys, especially because there's been a push to have them both on the field at the same time. Only one of them can get the ball. I think we've seen that the last year, especially with both guys on the field, certain situations, who gets it in the T formation. And, you know, some of those opportunities are just opportunity driven where, you know, one guy's on the left and the defense overloads to the way they were going to run. So they check to the other side and then that guy gets the ball. So there's got to be an understanding that it's not going to be the main part of your offense. This offense will be healthiest if they can base out of a 3 receiver set and then have the flexibility to go to 12 personnel and 22 personnel and 21 personnel and have that variety. Because the problem we saw last year is they could only really function in 22, 23, 2 backs, 2 tight ends sort of situations. That can't be the basis of your offense because it narrows the field. And Mike Yursich is not, I think the fault there was not being able to generate explosive plays without his fastball. I still think he's a good offensive coordinator. What he was doing by the end of his time at Penn State was so vastly different than what he was hired to do, presumably based on what he had done with other skill sets, other players, other positions. I'm not here trying to defend that it was a mistake. It wasn't. Andy Kotelnicki has proven he can get more explosive plays from this sort of offensive setup. But you're still best if you can throw the football to your receivers. So I guess that's really my question is how do they thread that needle? How do they get both these guys involved, get them to be more explosive and also not have them dominate the offense to the point where, again, it's 4 yards. You don't have any of that explosiveness in the passing game. So all of these things kind of open up when you have the balanced threats outside. And so it's not necessarily just a conversation about these two, but how do these two work in to optimize the offense and not fall into the trap of limiting yourself with having both of them on the field and suddenly you're running a triple option offense, which is not, I think in Penn State situation, something they should be doing. I think they can have elements of that, but they need to have the threat of the pass at all times. So there's just some of nuances of how it's going to translate from Kansas to Penn State that I'm interested to see how it works out.
T. Frank, I liked when they had those short yardage situations with them both in the game, but that's the special situation. As the base offense, I agree with you, but I also think, and you talk about this, the ability to integrate the running backs into the passing game. But
Yeah.
how do you do that without saying, okay, I'm going to rely on that at the expense of going downfield, correct? You got to have some balance there.
Yeah. So I guess these are my general concerns when it comes to an offense that targets the running backs a lot. And this is where I guess, the faith that Andy Kotelnicki is going to be able to not do these things, to be able to do something more creative and more dynamic is you run the ball and that averages in college, let's say 5 yards carry. That's, good. If you're Penn State, you'd like to average 6.5. That's when you got an explosive running game. But then if you're targeting the running backs, and typically running back targets are at most 2 or 3 yards down the field. Most of the time they're in the backfield. How do you take Nick Singleton and make him truly a threat down the field? There are only so many routes from the running back position you can run to get downfield. So how do they integrate these guys into the passing game without making Katron Allen a slot receiver? Essentially, like how do you put him in a position to be dangerous and explosive and not taking other players off the field who are better suited to the job he's doing? Because that's, kind of going back to my analogy before. It's like Katron Allen is a good receiving back, but if you move him to the slot and he's a receiver, there's probably somebody that can do that job better. And that's kind of what, they need to thread the needle with that Mike Yurcich really, I didn't seem to be able to do, which was adapt his offense to these talents to create explosive plays. At Kansas, he did that. At Kotelnicki did that. So can he do that against Big Ten defenses, which are, from a fabric standpoint, much tougher than Big 12 defenses generally?
Okay, let's move on to your final burning question, and it's, will a wide receiver one show up? What do you think, T. Frank? Are we going to have a number one wide receiver this season?
So it's funny. That's the question everyone wants to know, or it really isn't that though. The whole thing, I think, is open to interpretation. You've got a couple of returning players. You've got some veterans. Julian Fleming came in here for a purpose. They have, I think, a general plan of how they would want to use him. But where do players play, and how many snaps do they play in that position when you've got the class of 2022 that's got to start pushing on the ceiling here? They've got to start making some plays. You got some previous transfers that need to make some plays. They need to make a play for a position, not necessarily just plays on the field, which making plays on the field is how you make a play for a position. So anything and everything is open. Do you want to use Keandre Lambert-Smith in the slot, or do you want to move him out wide and shuffle things around? I don't think there has to be a template or a plan, as much as we went into last year saying Dre in the slot is going to be the best opportunity for him to be the best. I think at the end of the year, they said, we're going to do what's best for the offense, not necessarily we're going to try and put Keandre Lambert-Smith in the best position to succeed. So they used players differently to get different players open. So kind of the same process applies at receiver. I don't think there should be any preference of anyone plays anywhere. It's who are the best players? Are they getting open? Are they making plays? And whether the veterans fill the roles we're expecting or not, I don't think that's there's a lot of different combinations that can happen here. And I'm curious to see how that works out with a new offense and new offensive coordinator.
I want to ask you about one combination. Now, I've always been a Trey Wallace guy, but as we know, he's got to be on the field. He's got to be healthy to be able to do the job. But if you put out Julian Fleming, Keandre Lambert-Smith, and Trey Wallace as your three receivers, T. Frank, how do they fit together? How do they fit the different roles?
So this is just based off what we've seen. Not necessarily what they can. All of these guys can do different things. Even Julian Fleming from the slot is a possibility. But generally speaking, Trey Wallace was the X last year, where he would play to the boundary, the short side of the field. He'd be the sole single receiver on that side. You win one-on-ones. You have the opportunity to beat safeties in the corners on the backside of plays. There's a couple of different things, but generally it's more of the classic receiver corner matchup. The Z is kind of college's starting number one receiver in terms of there's more flexibility with that position to run behind that player, to run to the wide side of the field. You can do some zone stuff. You can do some man stuff. With Drew Aller's arm strength, you can hit any part of the field, so you can do anything with these guys. And then Keandre Lambert-Smith, I'd say in this best situation, is lining up in the slot with those two guys, Julian Fleming being the Z on the outside of that side. And then you have the versatility, like we said, to then put any of these guys in different places where you can condense somebody in and put Fleming in the slot. He's a big physical guy who can run block, and he's got enough wiggle to him to get open against zones and find the soft spots. So there's some versatility here, and there's some, kind of, we know what these guys' strengths are. So it's just a place to start with the veterans that we think are going to be part of the conversation. But then, if Mekhi Flowers is part of the conversation, I don't know. Caden Saunders, how does him making a play for playing time in the slot, presumably, what does that do to Keandre Lambert-Smith? Do they split that time? Does Dre move around the formation? How does any of that work? So it's just whatever combinations you can come up with the talent, you've got to have the flexibility to play guys where it's best overall for the team.
Very good, T. Frank. That's going to be the final word for the show. Thank you for all your expertise today, T. Frank. Thank you all for listening. Make sure you join us next time on the Keystone Kickoff Show.